Nice to at least virtually meet folks. These kind of trips do, or these kind of opportunities do save us on travel, which is awfully nice. And you get to meet folks who are all over the country and which you might not be able to otherwise meet. So I'm happy to be here with you. Can you hear me okay, Meredith? Is it audio is good? Okay. So unlike some of the other talks you're going to hear today, this talk is going to be just a little bit different. One of the reasons that that I think it's important to think about food safety culture and how food safety culture can be looked at on your operation is because it touches on a lot of different aspects of what we do on the production side. And the best way to think about that is integrating it into your whole operation. So this talk is not a scientific talk. It's going to be a little different than my co-presenters, but bear with me. I think you'll get something out of it. So the first thing when they asked me to talk about food safety culture, I started thinking about, well, how am I gonna define food safety culture? It's one of those things that's kind of broad depending on who you're talking to. So I did what every good academic does. I went to the dictionary and I looked up culture. And when looking for the definition of culture, just like a lot of these complicated topics, there's a lot of different aspects to culture. It has many different definitions. And I think one of the best summaries I heard about culture is this one that appears at the bottom. It's customary. It's traits of a social group. They're shared by people in a place or time. They characterize an organization, integrated patterns, and they depend on the capacity to learn and transmit knowledge. So we'll talk a little bit more about this, but just think a little bit about what that would mean in our own culture. The other thing that I thought was interesting that touches on food safety, culture is also a verb. To culture, it means to grow. And I think, there's nothing more appropriate for a food safety talk than talking about growing microbes, but we'll skip that for now and talk more about what culture means. So in terms of the key concepts of culture, one of the things to remember is we learn culture by observing other people. We're doing this today. We're learning about our culture and what culture means within the context of this room. You can think about culture within the context of your own family. How do you pass things down from generation to generation in your family that are important? You do that by observing other people. How do your parents behave? How do your children behave? They learn that behavior by watching other people. The other thing to remember is culture is supposed to be shared. You can't have culture by yourself. Culture only comes between two people or between a group of people. You can only have culture and shared culture if you share it with someone else. So something to remember is that culture is an active part of our life. The other thing to remember is culture uses words and symbols and behaviors. It's a series of those things that tell people within the group, what does culture mean to us? What is important to us as a culture? So taking it one step aside from the food safety aspect, we can see that there are shared cultural values all over the place. And this is just one example. It's really integrated into our whole life. And you guys are all over the place, all over the country joining us in this room today. One of the things that is interesting is, depending on where you go in the US, you can find different names for soft drinks, and it's very regional. And I think it's interesting, the poor graduate student who had to put together this culture map of the generic names for soft drinks. Not only does it vary state to state or region to region, they've drilled down to the county within the region where these names are used. And you can see that there are various pockets of where the names for soft drinks, pop, soda, Coke, depending on what you call that soft drink, really depends on the shared culture within your area of the country, right? And how does that happen? It happens because people transmit that name, that accepted nomenclature, to the people who are around them, in their families, in their social groups. Our goal with culture is to integrate that culture into our life so that we are part of that area, right? So you may come from a different part of the country where you called a soft drink pop, and now you've decided, well, everybody here calls it Coke, so I'm just going to call it Coke, right? Like, it's part of the new culture that you're a part of. The other thing with culture is that it helps to define shared values within that group. So think about it from the standpoint of something like the land-grant university system. Most of us are familiar with the land-grant system. And when we think about the land-grant values, we can think about, research, shared education, like we're doing today, extending knowledge. These are shared values that define that land-grant mission. And it's really that transmission or the living embodiment of those shared values that helps to push that mission forward, push those values forward. The other thing to remember is culture is dynamic, right? It changes all the time. And, if we were having this conversation 15 years ago, we never would have been having it via our phones and Zoom, right? Even 2 years ago, we wouldn't have known what Zoom was. 2 years ago, if we were going to do this online meeting, it would have been with Skype, right? Zoom has exploded in its use because it became a part of our dynamic culture. The other thing to remember about culture is that it does change, right? And we can see this in our own lives. When we go to other countries or other regions, we might try a novel food and say, whoa, we really like that. Let's bring that back and try to make it at home, or let's share that with our friends when we get home. So culture pulls us in different directions, and it changes us and changes the world around us. The other way culture changes is over long-term exposure. And the example I have here is McDonald's. You can hardly go anywhere in the world without finding fast food culture from the United States. Almost everywhere in the world, you'll be able to see familiar cultural icons that look like home. Now, you may go into those restaurants and look at the menu, and it might be completely different, right? But it's the changes that this culture has made to that food that makes a difference. The other thing is culture helps us understand problem solving within the context of a group. So the picture I have here is from Peru. That when you live on a steep mountain and you need agriculture, you find a way to make it happen. You need food, and food production is going to happen in that area. So independent problem solving is another way that cultures drift or change as a part of their new environment. Okay, you may be asking yourself, how do you know all this nonsense about culture? Well, who teaches culture in our society? Who talks about culture? Has anybody in this group taken a foreign language? I can't see any pictures, so you'll have to give me like a thumbs up or a hand wave. A number of us have studied a foreign language in school, right? Well, it turns out I'm married to a foreign language teacher, and these are the people who talk about culture in our society. They teach culture. They talk about culture. They want their students to understand not just the words of the language that they're instructing, but they want them to understand the culture in which that language developed. So I went to those experts and I said, how do you teach someone culture? If I want to convey a culture to someone, how do you teach it? Like, what's the method that you use? And my wife, who's a foreign language teacher, said, we do it in 3 different ways. We talk about products, we talk about perspectives, and we talk about practices. Okay, products, practices, and perspectives. So what are those? Products are things that you can see: books, tools, signs, literature, words, right? Practices are actions that people do, right? Things that people do that are within the cultural context. And then perspectives are the values and attitudes and ideas that people hold within a culture. So if we're going to apply that to food safety, what does that mean in our operations? If we're going to talk to people about food safety culture, we need to do it in a way that makes sense within these 3 broad areas, right? So let's think about it that way. Food safety culture on your farms or on the farms that you visit starts with leadership. You are the person, if you're talking to a person who's in charge of the culture on a farm, that person is in charge and is responsible for success. If they don't demonstrate food safety culture on the farm, food safety culture is not going to happen, right? It starts with us, with leadership. How is that person going to know about food safety? Well, you have to become aware of those risks. You know, the context of today, we're going to talk a lot about auditing and about looking for hazards, looking for risks on the farms. This is what we're talking about: making yourself aware as much as you can of the risks that are associated with the commodities that people are growing. Help people understand who don't know that these things are happening. You know, outbreaks happen. We talk a lot about outbreaks in our small groups as we're learning more about them. The reason is not because we're fascinated by outbreaks. The reason is because we want to learn as much as we can from mistakes so that we can stop those mistakes from happening again. And it doesn't take very much digging to realize that sometimes we're good at that and sometimes we're terrible at that. We like to think of outbreaks as one-offs, but when you start digging into commodities, you can see multiple examples of outbreaks over time. So understanding why those things are happening and changing them is really critical. In terms of food safety culture on the farm, once you know something, knowing it means nothing unless you share it. You have to share that information that you've gained. You have to share this information with the folks that you work with. Empower everyone on the farm to be responsible for food safety, right? Food safety isn't one person's job. It isn't the food safety manager's job. It's everybody's job. And our goal is to make everyone aware that they are responsible for food safety. Because let's face it, if there's an outbreak on a farm and that farm is shut down, everyone loses their jobs, right? Everyone loses money. So it's not just the farmer, it's not just the food safety manager, it's everybody. Okay, so another aspect of this is use resources. Of course, this is going to cost some dollars. Sometimes implementation of change costs money. Other times it costs time in terms of training or increasing employee knowledge. The other thing to think about is how can you incentivize the knowledge or recognition of people who are doing a good job with food safety, right? And it doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be lots of monetary awards. Those are great. People love money, but money doesn't really motivate you when you look at the science of motivation. What motivates people is a recognition that they have done a good job, that they have done something that makes them exemplary to their peers, right? And something simple like best scrub brush, best cleaner, a simple award like this shows a person that even though it's cheesy, they've done something that's better than their peers, that's more outstanding than anyone else on the team. And I think people really try for that. And if any of you have ever participated in a chili cook-off and won the golden spoon, silver spoon, whatever the prize was, which was probably a spoon taped to a piece of paper, you know that you have now earned the jealousy of all of your peers because they all want that award, right? Everybody wanted that dang plastic spoon that they spray painted gold, right? So the other thing to think about with food safety culture on the farm is it takes a commitment. You have to be committed. How are you going to demonstrate commitment? You have to hold people accountable, right? You have to have something that you can measure with performance, whether it's cleaning, thoroughness of cleaning. I'm not talking about speed of cleaning. Everyone thinks, faster is better, but the truth is you do want it clean with efficiency, right? So if you're talking about cleaning containers, it's not about speed, it's about how well you do it. And then document it, show that you are holding people accountable, that you want this level of food safety culture on the farm, you're ready to measure it, you want to show and demonstrate it, and then you're documenting it. And we're going to talk a lot about audit schemes and auditing today, so documentation is part of the game. Okay. When we talk to farmers about food safety culture, a lot of times we're talking to food safety leaders on the farm, and they are learning and being educated and getting their certificates for the training, whatever the training we're giving is. But it's a very top-down approach. The leaders are supposed to decide what the food safety culture on the farm is. Managers are supposed to enforce that food safety culture across the employees, and workers are supposed to do what they're told by the managers to make culture happen, right? To comply with food safety culture. But I'm going to challenge you to rethink this model for food safety culture on farms. In reality, on a farm, everyone is responsible for food safety. Everyone is responsible for recognizing risks and has the same goal: lower the risk associated with their part of the farming operation. Whether it's a worker who's picking up produce in the field and notices a bird dropping or a deer scat in the field and is making a decision right there. There's nobody else. It's just that worker and his or her pick bucket making an instant food safety decision. Pick it up or skip it. Pick it up or skip it. Empowering that worker to know that skipping it is the right choice, and that if they do that, they are not going to be penalized. They should be rewarded for making a right choice, right? Managers are supposed to provide technical support for those people and encouragement for those workers so that they understand that was the right choice. Hey, I see something. Should I skip these? Yes, go 4 feet away, 2 feet away, whatever the ruling is. Encourage them to make those right choices over and over again. That's the way we ingrain food safety culture into our operations. And then leaders provide the resources to make food safety decisions happen, right? Very removed from the decision-making process. It's always the person at the front line who really needs the empowerment to make the right decision. So give them the ability to do that. Train them, empower them, reward them for doing those right things. And then assess it, right? Is food safety culture apparent on your farm? Are you doing what you say you're going to do? Look for it. Stand back, watch people, make sure that they understand what they're doing. And if they don't, take them aside, talk to them about what's happening, and do a retrain if you have to. tell them how food safety is supposed to work on this farm, so that the next time they have that same decision to make, they'll make the right decision. Okay, so a lot of times when we talk about food safety culture, we describe it like this. Well, I'll know it when I see it. I'll know it when I see it. So what does that mean? How do you know it when you see it? Well, let's take an example. Let's think about when you have a worker who's ill on your farm, or you're talking to a farmer about workers who are sick. A very common model is if a worker is sick, they don't get paid. Where is the incentive for a worker who is ill to tell you that they are ill if they know that the reward for coming clean about being sick is a day without pay? They're never going to tell you, right? I would challenge you to flip that food safety reward and punishment methodology and say, if you tell me you are sick, I'm not going to send you home. I'm just going to put you on a job where you do not handle fresh produce, right? So now instead of going home, maybe that person rides a tractor all day, plowing or tilling or whatever they're doing, where they don't contact produce. They're never in contact with product, right? The change means I now have the ability to tell you when I shouldn't handle produce, not when you tell me not to handle it. I'm coming to you now and saying, I'm sick, something's wrong, I shouldn't touch produce. Completely different model than looking for sick workers, right? Watching people when they wash their hands after the restroom. How many times is this person going to the restroom in an hour, right? Have that person come to you and say, I am ill, I shouldn't be doing this. Okay. The other thing to think about with food safety culture is it needs to be adaptable. It needs to be flexible. You may grow different commodities. You may have workers that need to be cross-trained on different jobs in order to accommodate different approaches for food safety culture integration. It should be the whole team. This is not just a food safety manager's job. This is everybody's job, right? It's part of the products, practices, and perspectives on this farm. This is part of who we are. Food safety culture is part of our lived culture on this farm, right? We're not just making widgets, we're making food. And I think that's part of the reason why most of us got into this farming business in the first place, is to grow food to feed people. All right, so how are you going to learn more about food safety culture? Well, here's the thing. We're not the only people who are trying to integrate food safety culture into food production areas. There's lots and lots of articles out there about food safety culture. Most of them are coming from other industries, the restaurant industry or the food processing industry. Read through that literature, find those nuggets that you may be able to use to help educate your workers, your farmer clientele, to increase their understanding of food safety culture on the farm. Okay.
All right, so we're going to move on now to Donna Clements. Donna works for Cornell University through the Produce Safety Alliance. Donna wears two big hats as part of the Produce Safety Alliance. She's our Northeast representative, so she's somebody that Wes, Jen, and I work very closely with, but Donna originally is from Maryland, so we've known her forever. We got to work closely even when you were out in California at that Southwestern rep. But Donna is also the program coordinator for the Produce Safety Alliance. So if you've participated in any events that the PSA has put on, you've probably seen Donna with that. So Donna today is going to talk about post-harvest sanitizer use and labeling. We've included presentations on post-harvest sanitizers for years. This is a topic that we still get lots of questions during our trainings with, and when we go out and do farm visits. So we're glad that Donna is going to be able to go a little bit more into depth with her work with sanitizers and some resources that she's developed, and some pearls of wisdom. So thanks, Donna.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Hey, everybody. So as Meredith mentioned, I'm going to be here to talk a little bit about using sanitizers in a post-harvest setting. And I think the reason that Meredith and Wes and Jen asked me to be here today is looking forward to managing post-harvest water. And I think Wes is going to talk about this next in the agenda, some of the current agricultural water requirements in the produce safety rule, but then also some of the proposed requirements. So I will share with you really quick before I jump into this presentation that when we talk about post-harvest water in the produce safety rule, so not necessarily audits, but with produce safety rule, those compliance dates are essentially happening now, so that enforcement has begun on post-harvest water. So in this talk today, I'm going to really talk. Let's see if I can, here we go. I'm going to talk really on using sanitizers in a post-harvest setting. I'm going to focus sort of on two general uses around the farm: cleaning and sanitizing, and managing harvest and post-harvest water. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to select a sanitizer, both in terms of EPA labeling and following the labeling requirements. And then I'm also going to briefly touch on some of the chemistry. And I'm going to also talk a little bit about some management considerations. And I want to say throughout this talk, I have included a number of resources. So the very last slide that I'm going to show you, I have a little QR code and a list of these hyperlinks in a Google Doc. So don't be too worried. What I tried to do is highlight some of my favorite resources that I've been using recently. But you will have access to them in a Google Doc, both a QR code, and I'll send you the link in the chat box once I'm done. But I did want to stop for a second and just ask you all, if you don't mind using the chat box or unmuting, I'm just really curious on your operations, how you are currently using sanitizers, if you are, and the type of sanitizers that you're using, maybe for cleaning and sanitizing, which you're likely already doing due to audit requirements, or for using sanitizers in post-harvest water. I'll give you all about 30 seconds. I was going to use, I am curious, just because I'm always adding to a sanitizer tool that I'll share with you. And I'm always curious for newer sanitizers, newer products or chemistries, but also just because I was going to adapt some of my examples. Any favorite sanitizers?
Are you getting any direct messages?
Nope.
Come on, guys.
It's okay.
There we go. Thanks, Fran. But we need more than Fran.
Thanks, Fran. So I see chlorine dioxide. Okay, perfect. So a lot of chlorine dioxide in the greenhouse. That is not something I know I've worked with chlorine dioxide a little bit out west, primarily using it for pre-harvest water treatment, but I have not seen it so much, especially post-harvest water use in back east. So that's really interesting. I know a lot of
our blueberry growers will use that.
Okay, excellent. And I know there are some of the newer, we'll call them technologies or products that make it relatively easy. There's sachets you can add water to. I think it's not so much a generated product that it used to be. Okay, thank you. Okay, Selectricide, Sanidate. Yep. Sanidate is one that I see quite a bit, and I'll walk through some examples. Perfect. I'll walk through some label examples looking specifically at Sanidate. Selectricide I know is another one that I think that's a chlorine based. Excellent. Thanks, guys. So I just wanted to make sure some of my labels and examples were on target for what you guys are currently using. So to take a little bit of a step back, the reason we are going to be talking about labeling is that when we use the term sanitizer, the technical term is an antimicrobial pesticide. So a sanitizer is specifically a substance that reduces the amount of microorganisms to acceptable levels. And I think that's key because sanitizing or sanitization is not the same as disinfection. So when we use the term sanitizer, we're really trying to, I like to think of it as a knockdown step. You're really knocking down those pathogens to acceptable levels. Generally, we're not, research shows us that we're not outright eliminating them. And in today's talk, I'm really going to focus on sanitizer use for two different purposes in post-harvest use. So sanitizing food contact surfaces, and then also for fruit and vegetable wash water. And the nice thing is that we do see a number of the sanitizers, and some of those that you listed here in the chat, we do see a number of those being labeled for different uses. So I see some growers, especially smaller scale, using a single sanitizer product to pretty much do all of the post-harvest sanitizing that they need to in their operation. So as a quick reminder, when we talk about using sanitizers in food contact surfaces, this is part of that, what we usually call that 4-step cleaning and sanitizing process. So starting off with a detergent or a cleaner, doing that cleaning step, washing it off. Here in this illustration, I have a pretty small scale example using a 3-section sink for that cleaning and sanitizing, normally, after harvest is wrapped up. And you can see that wash step, rinsing off any of that dirt and that soap or cleaner, and then that last sanitizing step. And one of the things that we do see the label talk a lot about is what is that contact, or how much time does that sanitizer need to come in contact with either the water, if it's post-harvest water, or those those food contact surfaces. And some of the examples that we see here are usually harvest knives, bins, tables, really anything that you're using at harvest or post-harvest that is going to come in direct contact with the produce. And then the second use that we're going to focus on here is post-harvest water management. I think this is really on everybody's mind with the produce safety rule requirements coming into play for harvest and post-harvest water. But the intent of using a sanitizer in harvest and post-harvest is really to maintain the quality of the water. And I know this is probably more of back to the basics information, but I think this is always a good reminder that when we're using sanitizers in post-harvest, we're not washing or we're not sanitizing the surface of the product. Yes, we are usually using water to try to get off any field dirt, dust, just for quality reasons. But when we use that sanitizer, we're not sanitizing the surface. Really, we're trying to prevent or minimize any potential contamination from spreading. And I have a couple of different examples here. In Maryland, at least, and I've seen this other places in the East Coast, when we see summer squash harvest, oftentimes we'll see a large dump tank being pulled on a trailer right in the field. And that's essentially the extent of the handling in a lot of summer squash that I see. So it's harvested right out in the field, it's sent into this quick dump tank, and that's really just to get off any squash blossoms, other squash debris, dirt. And then it goes and it's packed and it goes off to the next step. There is some benefits of using post-harvest sanitizers, and we're going to talk about this when it comes to labeling. But one of the big additional benefits to using a sanitizer post-harvest, in addition to maintaining that quality of the post-harvest water, is to reduce those plant pathogens or those spoilage organisms that can impact shelf life and rot. And I know some of the products you listed, like Sanidate, those are actually really intended to be used to minimize plant pathogens, not necessarily for maintaining post-harvest quality in terms of Salmonella, E. coli. But we'll talk about that when we get to the label. So the reason I wanted to delve into those two uses of sanitizers post-harvest is because depending on how you're using them in your operation, you will want to make sure that you're following the EPA label and using that product as it's intended to be used. So as it's listed on the label. I mentioned that sanitizers are all considered antimicrobial pesticides. So that means that they are regulated by EPA through the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, FIFRA. This is the same act that regulates any of the other agricultural pesticides or chemicals you're using on the farm. And as a reminder, the purpose of FIFRA is really to ensure that a product is going to limit that using that product is going to be used in a way to limit the risk to humans and the environment. So one of the additional components of EPA labels is they do discuss efficacy. So they list, you're going to be using this product. Here's why you're using it. Here are the organisms that it should be killing. But really, the primary reason for EPA labels is to establish that use. So it does minimize risk to humans and the environment. And I'll point out a few additional parts of labels that I know I usually bypass, but things that mention PPE. And again, it's really trying to target that minimizing risk. So when we talk about sanitizers in post-harvest use, they must be registered and contain an EPA number. This is a requirement that we see both in the produce safety rule, but also we see this in a lot of audit requirements. Now, I did quickly want to mention sort of this side thing because I'm sometimes contacted by auditors or growers who are having an audit. And I want to quickly mention that we tend to focus on EPA labeling of sanitizers because that's they generally regulate farm pesticides, farm chemicals. Now, FDA does regulate some sanitizers. However, those are generally regulated as food additives. So if you've ever heard of the term grass, generally regarded as safe, that's an FDA term. We don't normally see that term on farms because FDA usually has the jurisdiction of processors. So if you were selling your apples to, an apple slicer or further processing, there's a good chance that processor would then be regulated by FDA. And they would follow, any chemicals that they use are going to be considered food additives. So I just wanted to mention this as sort of a heads up that sometimes I'm contacted by people and they say, hey, I'm using this sanitizer, I'm using this product, but I can't find an EPA label. That sometimes if you go on the website, you'll start to see terms like, oh, it's a food additive or it's FDA approved. That doesn't necessarily mean you can't use it on a farm, but what that generally means is an auditor might ask questions because people are so used to using the EPA label. And it also might mean that it isn't quite researched on how it would impact a farm environment. So again, just wanted to mention that as a heads up. But usually if you look at a product's like labeling, like the product label or the website, you can quickly figure out based on the terms, oh, that's not really a farm product. That's why we don't see an EPA label. And let me know if you have any questions as I go. Now, we're talking a little bit about EPA labels. This slide might look familiar to you. I pulled it from the PSA grower training course training. But I think the information here is really important. And we usually give these blanket recommendations like follow the label, read the instructions. You only can use it as it's labeled. But we don't have a lot of time to go into further examples or some of the ways that you might want to double check what the label says specifically. And some of the things that a label frankly leaves out. I think, and I'll show you some examples, but I think a lot of times we look at pesticide instructions and we think it should kind of tell you all the considerations in using it. And that's not always the case. So here I wanted to mention one resource that we have up on the PSA website. This is a resource that I'm sort of in charge of. It's my pet project, if you will. And the reason this came about, so it's an Excel tool currently. We call it Labeled Sanitizers for Produce. And this came about initially when I was working in Maryland. Before I worked for Produce Safety Alliance, I worked for University of Maryland Extension. And I did a lot of work around the state helping growers prepare for food safety audits, because this was pre-FSMA, pre-produce safety rule. And we were finding that a lot of growers, were encouraged to use sanitizers, and these were, really growers of all scales. And we were finding that growers were, buying bleach from the dollar store, and those were the days of where we just said, okay, use a bleach product, just pick a bleach product, as long as it doesn't have gelling agents or scents, you're probably good to go. Now we've sort of moved along, and now, people are really trained to use EPA labeled sanitizers. And so we started pulling this list together because people kept asking us, what type of sanitizers should we use? We know you always mention Sanidate 5 and bleach, but there must be other options. What are some of the options I can work with my my chemical supplier for? So that's where this tool came about. And I will say we are actively updating it. I was hoping it would be finished before this talk, but it wasn't. We are actively updating this. We're moving it from an Excel-based tool, which is kind of clunky, to a web app or a web tool. So it will just be a simple website, but the how it's used is not going to change very much. It'll just be a lot easier for us internally to update and for you all to navigate. So I wanted to mention this for anybody who might want to double check what the EPA label says for their product. This tool is not inclusive in that it might be missing things. However, based on my experience, whenever people tell me chemicals that they use, it is usually in this tool. So what I wanted to show you here is this tool kind of highlights a few different things: active ingredients, label information, which I will share some more with you later, and then also product information. But this is really intended to be a way to help quickly read through and interpret label information for each of these products listed. And there's about 75 or so products on the tool. So the first question we usually ask is your sanitizer product EPA labeled? And I know, at least from the list that you all sent me here, I will have to double check to see if the chlorine dioxide products, Keeper and I know we have Oxine. I'm not sure about Keeper. I think that one might be new to me. So if not, I'm actually working on this tomorrow, so I'll add it into the tool. But I know the others are all EPA labeled. We often talk to some growers that, they want to start small. So they might be using Clorox bleach, something that they can just purchase from Home Depot or their grocery store. So the first question is finding that EPA label, if there is one. And I like using Clorox bottles as an example because it's actually pretty difficult to find. Sometimes it can be difficult to find the EPA number on the bottle. So here you can see it's usually by the UPC code on Clorox products. So there are a couple of ways you could go about it. You could look at the product bottle, find the manufacturer's website, or you could use the sanitizer tool as an option. There is also a really fantastic tool called NPIRS, the National Pesticide Information Retrieval System. So this is all pesticides. I tend to use it for sanitizers, for food safety, but you can look up any pesticides here. And this is a very quick way to search and find the actual EPA label. The reason we talk about the actual EPA label is that sometimes the labeling, so if you actually pick up that bottle, but that the labeling is what we call the label on the bottle, that doesn't have all of the potential uses listed because there's only a certain amount of room or space on the product bottle. So where we find the EPA label helpful is if you are using a product that is maybe not necessarily an agricultural product. So maybe it's something like Clorox germicidal bleach, or a different product. Clorox germicidal bleach doesn't have post-harvest water on it or fruit and vegetable washing water on it. So if that's something that you were interested in working with, you could double check the EPA label and you can find those use instructions on it. Otherwise, it's not extremely important that you look and read through the EPA label unless there were specific details that you were looking for. But again, this NPERS is a really easy way. You can look either by the EPA registration number, the manufacturer, or the product name, but it's a pretty quick way to look this information up. So the way it works is if you do use this, you would add in the name or add in the information, and then there's this little icon that you can click on, and it would pull up the most recent label information. And then you would click on it, and it opens up this PDF. Now you can see that this is CLB. So this is actually that Clorox germicidal bleach, the same bottle that I showed you in the previous slide. I wanted to mention here that depending on the sanitizer you're using, the product name that you see on the bottle does not always line up with the product, the name on the EPA label, because sanitizer companies, kind of like drug companies, if you think of like ibuprofen, you might have Advil, you might have Walgreens, store brand ibuprofen. Pesticide or sanitizer labeling can work in similar ways. So don't be worried if you look up the EPA number and the product name doesn't completely align. As long as those numbers align, that's really the way to go. And that way you know it's the same product. It can be very, very confusing, I've learned, in sort of the realm of sanitizer interpretation. So the other functionality I wanted to highlight in this tool is it will help you, and I know it's a little small, but we do have this label information tab. And where I find this tool most helpful is it can allow you to very quickly navigate the labeled uses for a sanitizer. So here we have the EPA label. Again, we hyperlink directly to the label so you can find the most up-to-date one. A few of you mentioned Sanidate. I'm going to guess you're using Sanidate 5.0. There's also Sanidate 12, Sanidate 15. They actually do have slightly different labeled uses. But I would guess you're using maybe Sanidate 5, and you can see on this tool that Sanidate 5 is labeled for food contact surfaces, non-porous, so not wood, but things like stainless steel, plastic, other non-porous food contact surfaces. It's labeled for use in fruit and vegetable wash water, and it is also technically labeled for use in irrigation water, so treating pre-harvest water. But you will see in this far side, does it contain an efficacy statement to control public health organisms? We will get to that in a couple of slides, because I think that's a really big sanitizer labeling current event, I guess, or something that we're seeing slowly change in the industry. Okay, so I'm going to quickly take you through interpreting the sanitizer label using that Clorox disinfecting bleach. That's a common one that you can buy at like Lowe's or Home Depot. And then also Sanidate 5.0, which is a peroxyacetic acid. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go through this so I can get to the meat and get to the parts where I think it's most relevant for you all and where you are in, I guess, in the scale and using sanitizers. But I just want to highlight that, this is where it says EPA's FIFRA is a federal law, so you have to use it. That's where we get the information. The label is the law. You have to follow these instructions. But then looking at the labeled use of using this product on food contact surfaces. So the two things that we see here for Clorox disinfecting bleach and Sanidate 5.0 is that both of these are labeled for food contact surfaces. So you could use these on, your harvest tools, bins, things like that. But then it also gives you the actual use instructions. So it tells you how you can mix it up, how you can dilute it. And the other thing I want to highlight here is that, let's see, I'll show you on this next use. So this is showing you the label information for fruit and vegetable wash water. Both, again, Clorox disinfecting bleach and Sanidate 5. Now, this is where the uses start to differ slightly, and the instructions start to differ slightly, because Sanidate 5.0, this is really sort of an agricultural product, right? Clorox is more, we consider it more of a household product. So you are allowed to use something like Clorox disinfecting bleach for fruit and vegetable washing. It does say commercial use. However, you're only allowed to use it to up to a dilution or up to a concentration of 25 parts per million. Now, a lot of the commercial or agricultural bleaches or sodium hypochlorite will let you mix it up to a concentration of about 150 parts per million. And that just gives you a much higher buffer. So that means you don't have to go in likely every 10, 15 minutes and double check that concentration. So for commercial use, I will often recommend, if you have a slightly larger production, I would recommend looking for one of those agricultural sodium hypochlorite or bleaches, just because it's a lot easier to use. The other thing here is that it asks for a contact time of 2 minutes. That's a really long time in commercial production. And then it's asking you to rinse with water and air dry. So again, there's a rinse step. Just even though it is labeled, it's going to take a little bit more effort, a longer contact time. It's just more difficult to work with. In comparison, a lot of your agricultural products say maybe a wait time of like 30 seconds. So something that would be more in line with a flume, and it does not require a rinse step either. So just a little bit easier to work with. The thing I want to mention here about Sanidate 5, again, you see the dilution instructions, a contact time 45 seconds. But what I want to show you here is this sentence that says, at this dilution, Sanidate 5.0 will control the growth of spoilage and decay causing non-public health organisms. So, and then this product is not intended for control of any public health organisms. So when we say public health organisms, that means, you know, our food safety organisms. So Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria. And this is something I wanted to highlight for you because Sanidate 5 is absolutely allowed in post-harvest water washing. However, we're starting to see more discussion around the fact that auditors might be looking for this, inspectors in the produce safety rule. They might start looking for products that are specifically labeled to control public health organisms. And I know that BioSafe, the manufacturer of PAA, I've had conversations with them, and we're starting to see in like Sanidate 12 and 15, I think, some of those products are labeled to control these public health organisms in water. So again, not anything that you can still use Sanidate 5 for fruit and vegetable wash water, but more of a heads up that in the future, I can see this going the way of people really wanting to see sanitizers that control your public health organisms. Any questions there? Okay. And then lastly, to talk about labels, again, I mentioned this efficacy statement. Going back to food contact surfaces, Sanidate 5 is labeled for cleaning and sanitizing food contact surfaces against these public health organisms. It's really just in the washing stage that Sanidate 5 is not labeled for that. So you can still use it. It's really just intended to kill off spoilage organisms in post-harvest water. Another just really quick tip, if you do have to go through the EPA label, I would encourage you to use Control F because sometimes these labels are really long, like 50, 60 pages long. So you can just quickly do Control F and search vegetable and you can find it very quickly. Okay, and then lastly, the label also shares information like PPE. Just a reminder that a lot of these products can be really nasty, very corrosive. You do not want them splashing in your eyes. So a lot of these labels will have PPE requirements, and then also, of course, your storage and disposal. Okay, so since I mentioned a lot about the efficacy statement to control public health organisms, this is something that we have in the label. And this is something that I do expect over the next couple of years. I think we are going to start seeing a lot more of these products that are labeled for fruit and vegetable washing. The sanitizer companies, they have to do research. They have to sponsor research to get this efficacy data. So essentially, they have to demonstrate that their product, if it's used at that dilution that's in the label, it will actually kill off these public health organisms. And that's what I think a lot of these sanitizer companies are sort of actively gathering that data. So I do expect over time, we're going to see a lot of these labels start to, for food safety reasons, start to be labeled for fruit and vegetable wash water actually killing off these organisms. Okay. Any questions? No.
Donna, the thing about Senadate 5, for instance, where it says it can be used on hard surfaces,
Yep.
but it's not to control organisms of health organisms. What's the rationale between the two?
Okay. Give me 1 second. Can you hear me, Wes?
Yes, yes.
Okay. My PowerPoint just crashed, so I wanted to make sure you guys could still hear me. Can you say that one more time? What's the rationale between the label statement for public health organisms for food contact surfaces versus water?
Correct.
Okay, I personally think part of it is liability, because I think once a company puts that on the label, you know, they're liable for it. They have to demonstrate that efficacy. And I think when you think about all the factors that go into managing post-harvest water, there's a lot of factors there to consider, both on the research stage and on, you know, the actual use stage. Here we go. Perfect. Sorry. I'm trying to pull up my slides again. So that's part of it, I think. But the other is, we know from research that most of these products are effective in post-harvest. I think it's just getting that data and then, you know, having it added to the label. I think part of it maybe could be marketing. You know, if a company has a product that's already labeled, why wouldn't they push you to, you know, Sanidate 12, for example, instead of Sanidate 5? So I think there's a lot of factors there. I also firmly think that most people have been using Sanidate 5 and it's been, you know, completely fine. Nobody's been pushing back on it. So I think until the manufacturers are being asked to add it to their label, I think they're kind of waiting for that push to happen. And they're starting to get that now. So I've talked to some companies who are now like, oh, there is a need. There's a market reason I need to invest in this. And I do think that's sort of the background. Does that answer your question, Wes?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Let me pull this up. Let me find where I was. Okay. So I mentioned I don't have a lot of time in this talk to go deeply into chemistry. Now that we talked a little bit about the EPA side of things or the labeling side of things. So I will briefly mention some of the available sanitizer chemistries out there. But I did want to put a plug in on this very fantastic fact sheet. It's called Food Safety Considerations for Post-Harvest Washing of Produce and Sanitation of Packing Areas. So this fact sheet kind of addresses basics of chlorine chemistry. And the reason some of these basics are really important is because then they can help you manage your chlorine use in a way that makes it most effective for your operation. It talks a little bit about peroxyacetic acid and some of those other factors, but then it also discusses those chemistries for both cleaning and sanitizing and post-harvest wash water. So this is one of my favorite, very, very practical fact sheets, and it is in the resource list that I'll send you. So I'll make sure you guys have a copy of this. Oops. So quick rundown of some of the available chemistries. First, looking at chlorine, there are, I'll say, three main forms that we tend to see being used in post-harvest. The first is sodium hypochlorite. That's usually what we call bottle bleach. It's usually a liquid. That's the example that I showed you, that Clorox example, but there are agricultural versions that are, I think, easier to work into production. Then there's also calcium hypochlorite. There were quite a few growers in Maryland that were starting to use AccuTab, I think is the main one that I've seen around. And this is in a powder or tablet form. And then also chlorine dioxide. And I know this was mentioned, I think, by Fran, using chlorine dioxide. And this tends to be, we see like a sachet. So it's a very simple add of water. I have not used chlorine dioxide personally. That's probably the one that I'm least familiar with. But the mode of action on all of these is very similar, is that when they're dissolved in water or somewhat diluted, the idea is that hypochlorous acid is formed, and that's essentially what kills off the microorganisms in the water. But what I wanted to highlight for you all is some of the main factors impacting chlorine efficacy. A lot of people select a chlorine-based product because it tends to be cheaper, but there are a number of considerations to manage. And what I want you to get out of this slide is that a lot of these factors are not listed in the label instructions that for example, that I showed you. So it includes instructions like, make sure you use this dilution. You need to know this contact time. But especially for chlorine, again, if you're investing in this product, you want it to be impactful. You want it to be effective. So when dealing with chlorine, you will also need to consider, what is the pH of your water? So if you're pulling it from a well, what is that pH when it comes out of the well? But then also, if you're using a large dump tank and you are adding chlorine over time, your pH is going to increase as you add chlorine or as you add, for example, bleach. So you'll want to make sure that you're managing or at least monitoring that chlorine, because you want it to be effective. And then similar with organic matter in the water and water temperature. So water temperature will impact off-gassing. It can impact, infiltration. So water coming into the produce, but then also organic matter like turbidity or that will impact, and that will make your product less effective. So again, just wanted to highlight that fact sheet I told you does a great job of sort of walking through some of the chemistry implications, but these factors are not usually listed on the label instructions. The other chemistry I wanted to quickly highlight is peroxyacetic acid. And I know a number of you are using Sanidate, so that's an example of a PAA. I see a lot of PAA products out there. They tend to be a little more expensive than chlorine. However, a lot of people think they're easier to manage and deal with. So that's one of the reasons they go with PAA. They also have a number of organic approved formulations. But that's something that I see a lot of people using. And then there are a couple of other products that we see. UV light. UV is most effective for treating clear water because you need that penetration. But I will sometimes see this more on the post-harvest side of things. But it's often used in conjunction with other sanitizers. So it'll be like a two-step process. And then ozone is another one that I have not seen a lot recently, but this is more of a device. So you would purchase the device and then you would use it according to the manufacturer's instructions. And that doesn't build up a large buffer, but that is a way to treat the water as well. Okay, so I have a couple of minutes left. So I just want to leave you with a few resources. And these are all going to be on the list that I share with you. But in terms of dosing, there are a couple of resources out of the University of Vermont. This is Chris Callahan is an ag engineer, and his group does a lot of very creative, effective resources on using sanitizers. So one of them is a dose calculator. If math is not your strong suit and you're trying to calculate the amount that you need, this is a really nice web tool. The other is dispensing sanitizers. This tends to be on the smaller scale side of things, but there's a section on automatic dosers. So for example, if you're using chlorine or even proxacetic acid, I know Sanidate has a doser that they, like a dosatron essentially, that they will sell to you specifically for their product. Okay, so in summary, what I want to leave with you is when you are selecting your sanitizer, or maybe you're kind of reconsidering the sanitizer that you're using, make sure that it is first labeled for your needs. Are you using the same product for produce washing as well as food contact surfaces? But then also, how easy is it to use? Maybe you're using one of the chlorine-based products and you're finding that managing all those factors are really finicky. Maybe it's requiring that you rinse it, and that's just not effective in your operation, as well as contact time, reactivity, and then also quantity. I know some growers are moving to either larger quantities or smaller because they can't get through the product quick enough. But these are all considerations for when you're figuring out what product to purchase. There are resources available for standard operating procedures, both in order to have a written SOP, because I know that is required in the audit, but also I find these helpful to read through and be like, you know what, I haven't considered that before. So these are kind of helpful as procedures if you were kind of developing your personal procedure for the farm. Things like, how are you going to measure concentration? Are you using your one standard thing with a Sharpie line and you just fill it up? You fill up the dump tank the same amount and you're dumping it in? Do you have a more prescriptive approach? How are you adjusting pH? How often are you changing water? All of these are factors that you could consider adding into your SOPs. So with that, I wanted to pass along this list of resources. So this is a QR code. It should work if you take a picture, but I will also send the link. I'll drop that in the chat box in a moment. And with that, I will pass it back over to Jen or Meredith or Wes. I don't know if we have time for a question or so. But...
Yeah, we do. We have a minute or two. Does anybody have any questions for Donna? Have you all been on to the sanitizer database before? No. Okay. It is great. And the fact that she's got the links to directly to certain pieces of information, and I feel like that has been the biggest help for me when I know I'm looking for some information pretty quickly, just to be able to find, you know, the column that I'm looking for and the product, and being able to go right to that. So, oh, and Donna, thanks for putting that Google Doc link right there in the chat.
Yep.
Donna, this is Wes again. What's your recommendation for someone who's using a automated injector system? And how often should they manually check that?
So I would say when you're setting it up, there's going to be a certain amount of, I would check it much more frequently. I would say most people do it daily. And they'll use, so you could check it in a couple ways. I didn't get into, I had a bunch of test strips here. But I would recommend doing a titration, or maybe a test strip, but a titration like once a day at least. But I think part of that recommendation would go, what is the history? So I know all dosatrons or all automatic dosers are not created equal. So I would say once a day, if you check it every day and it's going really well, but I would probably recommend more often. I know some people do once an hour. Again, it kind of depends on how much flow they have and how accurate it tends to be. But once an hour, I don't think the audit is prescriptive, right? No. Okay, it's been a little while since I've looked at it, but I know larger operations will do like once an hour or more when they're actively running product through. Yeah.
I've been in operations where there were automatic injectors and there was nothing being put out
Yes,
because no one was checking them.
yeah.
Well,
I
they
actually,
probably heard the click, right? They hear the click, so it must be
Right.
working.
I actually work one of the most ingenious, I think, ingenious or it, yeah. He set up like a toilet thing, like a toilet float. And when it got low enough, they had this red light turn on. And that way it was just like a visual, like, oh, we got to go add more. They were using Sanidate 5. We got to go dump more in. So I thought it was ingenious, but then I also know that they ended up relying on that red light a lot, and then they didn't then check as much. So they had some issues later down the road, but I thought that was really creative.
All right. Well, thank you, Donna. We really appreciate you spending time talking with us today about that. All right, Russ, are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. So next up, we've got Wes talking about production water and post-harvest water updates that are specific to the FSMA produce safety rule. Thanks, Wes.
Okay. Whoops. It's not moving. That's interesting. There we go. Just a little slow. There we are. Okay, I'm going to talk about what are some of the changes and proposed changes, but I want to put this slide up first. This is related to harvest and post-harvest water only. So we're not talking about irrigation water. We're talking about anything you would do with harvest or post-harvest water. It is in effect now for operations over $500,000 when in effect in January. So the next one, the 250 to 500 will be next year, and the smaller operations will be the year after that. I'll go into more detail later on, but I just wanted to point this out because this is in effect right now. As far as agricultural water, or in our case, irrigation water, there is a proposal out from FDA, and this will change things somewhat because it's related to how you assess your water or your irrigation system. It's removing the idea of testing as the primary way of doing it. You can still test, and we'll talk more about that, but you would need to do an agricultural water assessment. And I'll talk more about what that means. What this really does, it puts the onus back on the grower to decide how they evaluate their irrigation system and what standards they're going to use. And then when there's an inspection, you would need to explain to the inspector what it means. So it really puts the onus on the grower to think about how they're going to evaluate. Now, there are several things that FDA is proposing that you would need to do, and I will make some comments about some of these. And also, it has to be in writing. The source of the water, whether it's groundwater, surface, municipal water, whether it's a closed system or open, in our case, they're closed systems because we do not do furrow irrigation in this area. Also, what type of protection is if you have a pond, for instance, what's the animal access to that pond or the adjacent land? The other thing you would have to mention about what system you're using, overhead, drip, would be the two in our case. And the time interval from the last application to harvest. This is going to be an issue for us because, again, if you look at something like cilantro, parsley, we're harvesting and irrigating essentially at the same time because you're not harvesting a whole field. That would be true with lettuce also and some of the other crops we grow, most of the leafy greens. Crop characteristics that you would have to assess, the susceptibility of surface adhesion or internalization. This is one I am not sure how you're going to do it. We right at this point have no direction from FDA how you would assess that. And there is very little data to support how you would do it. So this is something that is going to have to be discussed in much more detail. The other thing you would need to assess is the environmental conditions, frequency of rain or extreme weather, air temperatures, sun exposure. Again, we do not have any direction what you would need to do in these cases, how you would record it, how often you record it, or if it's just a statement, well, we get heavy rains the month of July. We just don't know what this means. The other thing is testing if you are going to test. So these are the 5 areas that you would have to have in your assessment. Again, this is not in effect yet. I'm going to make that very clear. So after you do assessment, if the water's not safe for use, what would you do? Immediate discontinue use and do a corrective action before the next, before you start harvesting. If you find that the reason why it may not be acceptable is because of animal activity, biological soil amendments of animal origin, or human waste, what would you do? First of all, as far as human waste is concerned, even though under FSMA, if it's a certain quality of sludge you can use in New Jersey and in the Mid-Atlantic, we do not recommend the use of biosolids. The reason being is there can be issues with heavy metals. There can be issues if you're going to sell that land later on. In New Jersey, you would have to do an environmental impact study, which is going to cost you a lot of money. So we do not recommend, excuse me, use of human waste. So if you have one that falls into this category, you would have to make corrections promptly, but no later than the same growing season. If the issue may be related, that's not related to animal activity or biological soil amendments, what would you do? You, again, implement as soon as practical corrections, but no later than the following year, or test the water as part of your ag water assessment. Again, you do not need to use, at this point under the proposal, you do not need to test unless you want to. If there are no issues, then it's inspect and maintain the water system regularly at least once a year. So you'd have to do an inspection each year, one of these ag water assessments. The proposal is that the ag water assessment will take the place of those multiple, testings that is in the proposed, in the 2015 proposed rule, which was that 20, for instance, surface water be 20 samples. So right now, this is the proposal to take the place of that. So what would be a corrective action? Is that first one is the most critical. Reinspect the entire system. They're under your control, or treating the water with the standards of FSMA. However, at this point, you can treat that water as long as you're not applying it to the crop. EPA and FDA are working on proposals, and I've put them out to the chemical companies to come up with products that could be used on the crop and through the irrigation system. But at this point in time, there are none that are approved to put on the crop. So you can, for instance, underground main, you can treat that to take care of any problems you may have, but that water could not be put on the crop. As far as mitigation is concerned, again, making any changes or repairs, increase the interval time from 4 days between the last application and harvest. And this is what is in the rule now as a die-off for before harvest. Also increase the time between harvest and storage if you're storing a product. Commercial washing, change the water application method. In other words, going from say sprinkler to drip if possible. Treating the water or anything else that would support what you're doing. However, you need to have the scientific data to back that up, which means unless there is published papers out there somewhere, you're going to spend a lot of money to come up with what would be acceptable. Anyone have any questions at any time, please ask. So what is the reassessment that you would have to do each year? And you would have to, or anytime you make significant changes. So again, the water system, your water practices, crop characteristics, environmental conditions, or anything else that may cause a hazard. And this has to be written on whether it's corrective or a mitigation measure and what was needed and how it was done. Now, there are some exceptions. If the water you're using meets the criteria for harvest or post-harvest water, which is non-detectable generic E. coli or zero generic E. coli, or I'm sorry, no generic E. coli, then you would not need to do that ag water assessment. And in most cases, wells in New Jersey should be able to meet that standard. If you do have generic E. coli in that water sample, when you pour it out of the well, directly out of the well, you have a problem with the well. And that really should be addressed. It can easily be addressed because you can shock wells just like well drillers do. But again, that's one of the exceptions. The other exception is if you're using water for harvest or post-harvest that comes from a public water system, as long as you get a certificate of competency or compliance from them, which you can easily get, or you treat the water according to the standard. And as I said, if that water is going to go on a crop, then it wouldn't, you couldn't do that. So you do have to have records. This is an additional to what we've talked about with FSMA in the past. It needs to be a written record for pre-harvest ag water assessment. Description of how you did it, the factors that was included, whether it was corrective or mitigation measures that were needed. Growers can continue to test if they want to test, but you have to have the reports for those tests. And as with anything else under FSMA, the supervisor would need to review the documents and sign off on them. When the pre-harvest or irrigation water goes into effect, right now the proposal is for operations over 500,000, it would be 9 months after the effective date that would go into effect. We do not know for sure when the pre-harvest water rules are going to be released. Our best guess is sometime towards the end of 2023. But we do not know for sure if that's the case. Also, these proposed dates can change because FDA may decide that they are going to change those and lengthen them out. They will not be shorter than this. That I can be fairly confident, but they could be longer. So an operation that's 250 to 500,000, they would have a year plus 9 months, and the smaller operation would have 2 years plus 9 months. So what should you do in the meantime? If you're sampling, you should continue to sample. If you're not sampling, you should start sampling. At least get a baseline of what your water is, what the quality of that water is. Also, look at your system, look at the whole, your water system, survey it, see where there may be potential problems. So we're back to the harvest and post-harvest water only right now. Under the rule, the way it's written and the way it will be, is you will need to test 4 times within a year for generic E. coli. And those tests would have to show no detectable generic E. coli. If that's the case, then you would go back to testing once per year. If generic E. coli was found, then you would have to go back to 4 tests a year. Now, the question has come up by growers is, I've been sampling for the last 10 years. Can I use that data? Why do I have to go to 4 tests now since I've tested 10 years and we've never had a problem? That question has been asked to FDA and we do not have an answer at this time. It's conceivable they'll say, well, that's fine. You have the test, then you can continue your, for instance, 1 test a year. but we do not know that. Okay? Is from what you're doing now until we find out about the interpretation of some of this information. That's
I
it.
can't believe there's no questions on that,
I don't blame anyone for not having questions on it.
or at least not like shaking their fists. Well, all right. Well, thank you, Wes, for switching things up and throwing that in on the end. I think it's good. Oh, it's always good to have a heads up, even if it's a couple years out. It's good to know it's coming and have an idea of at least some of what the impacts will be. So thanks, Wes. Okay, so next up we're joined today by Jill Dunlop. Jill is the program coordinator at the USDA AMS Specialty Crops Inspection Division. And Jill is going to give us an update on the harmonized audit standard. So thanks for being here today, Jill.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Let me see if I can get this going here.
Yep. Nope, I can see your slides, so it's sharing properly.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, so I am with the USDA AMS. I help to update the standard and participate in that process. So today I'm going to talk about our harmonized GAP program. And just kind of want to give, I'll touch on a brief background and then some of the changes that we recently incorporated into the standard, and then also what might be coming down the pipe. So, okay, so just really brief background here, just so we're all kind of on the same page. And if you could chime in the chat and let me know if you are audited to either the standard harmonized or the plus version of the harmonized audit. That way I kind of can gauge where you guys are at with the program. But with the harmonized GAP audit, many of you are probably familiar with the former organization United Fresh. They are now International Fresh, and they help to oversee this harmonized initiative to create this audit scheme that would be recognized, across the board as in terms of food safety to help prevent some audit fatigue. And then also the difference for the harmonized plus is where we went into a little bit more in depth, because some buyers were wanting a standard that met the GFSI technical equivalence program. So those that standard, it goes a little bit more in depth, has some additional requirements, which have if you are familiar with our standards, it's a nomenclature, usually starting with F for field or P for post-harvest. And if you encounter a requirement that has a letter at the end, that is part of our plus standard. So any requirements that have a letter nomenclature at the end of the requirement would be an additional question. So here, if you're kind of wondering, well, which program would I want to take? It's kind of based on what your buyer needs. So what you would need to meet for your buyer's requirements. So we have the standard harmonized GAP, and this is word for word what the harmonized initiative put forth through the United Fresh group. And then it has been recently updated back in 2021, which I will go through those briefly, those changes, which was to make sure it was in alignment with the produce safety rule. And then we also have the harmonized GAP plus, which in that case is those additional questions that we needed to meet the GFSI technical equivalence. So goes into a little bit more detail. And then, depending on what your buyer requires, would be which one you might want to choose. So first I'll talk about the changes to the harmonized standard itself. And at the end of this talk, I will drop into the chat links to our website where you can go and get direct access to the standard. But as you can see, it was updated back in February of 2021 and went into effect in May. So if you do participate in this audit scheme, then you have already seen these changes. And then, so just what got changed was, again, like I mentioned, we aligned the standard to reflect the requirements of the produce safety rule. We also went ahead and added the tomato addendum so that those that have commodity specific requirements for tomatoes, it's a voluntary program, that they could add it on as well. And again, GFSI also every few years sends out a new version. And so we needed to update so that we were still meeting the technical equivalent. So we needed to make some updates for that as well. And then this is just to kind of show you when you're, completing your request for your audit services, you have the option to choose, between several different programs. So the field operations and harvest, and then you can see now we have the 4 different tomato protocols. If that is, you're growing tomatoes and you need that, it's a voluntary program that you can now add on. And it's possible in the future that we would do this for other commodities. For example, mushrooms or possibly cantaloupe. It could be added in as well. So I guess I would say stay tuned for that. Now, in terms of the updates, like I said, most of you, if you've already gone through our program back in 2022, last year, you had to comply with these requirements. So I won't go into too much depth, but as you can see, there were a lot of updates surrounding the worker health and hygiene. So you can see there were several there. And then we also moved some questions that were a part of previously and only the plus standard got moved up into the regular standard. Food defense was one of them, as the hazard analysis for the packing house. And you'll see when we do updates in the future that that's a trend that will continue. So in terms of corrective actions, this was something that was added in. And here we have an auditor who is looking to see that the operation has a written procedure on how they'll handle product that is possibly contaminated or been contaminated. And so we'll be looking for a written procedure that covers not just the product, but also packaging, if packaging was to become contaminated as well. And then for worker health and hygiene, we have several additional verbiage that went into the requirement to help make it clearer. For example, for restroom design, making sure that the bathroom doors or that restrooms don't open directly into a production area if it is a permanent restroom facility. So this would not apply to field sanitation units. We're talking about a permanent fixture. If it opens into a produce area, we're looking for some sort of mitigation measure like a door distance or like a maze type entrance. There was a change made to the disposal of toilet tissue. So in most instances, we're familiar with, we want the toilet paper to be disposed directly into the toilet, but we had issues come up where there might be some mitigating circumstances where the plumbing, maybe there was some sort of emergency in that area where the plumbing went down. What is an alternative that they could use? So there is now an exception if the plumbing cannot handle that at that moment in time, that we would make an exception. So they would just need to have some sort of procedure in place to make sure that the condition is still a sanitary condition. And that would be heavily scrutinized to make sure that they were not having any possibilities of cross-contamination. So that's kind of a tricky one, but one where they are allowing an exception. And then in terms of the toilet and wash stations, this is so that if you are using a field sanitation unit, or you have a portable tank for your hand washing, that there is a procedure in place where the water is being changed at a good enough frequency so that there's not the possibility that the water is becoming contaminated. So it's not becoming stagnant, that sort of situation. And then a completely new requirement for putting in a written response plan, so that if there is an accident in the field with the field sanitation unit leaking or something like that, that there's a process in place to do a corrective action to mitigate whatever contamination might have occurred. And then for food defense here, 2 questions that now we're looking for the operation to assess their vulnerabilities for any kind of potential security breach. And then, so that's the first question. And then the second question is, they also need to have a written response plan in place in case there is a security breach. So what would they do in that instance? And if they did have a security breach, the auditor would be looking to see that there's a record of the incident. All right, and then in terms of the facility, I mentioned that now there is a requirement for a hazard analysis to assess the hazards throughout the process of the operation. And that'll be a written document. All right, and then there's also a focus on food contact surfaces and packaging, where we have had a previous requirement for the cleaning agents to be appropriate for use that only applied to post-harvest for whatever reason. And so now it's being made sure that is also a requirement for the field part of the standard. And then now there is a written procedure that is required for inspecting the incoming packaging materials. And then also needing written procedures for the cleaning of any kind of contact materials. So for pallets, produce bins, totes, those kinds of things, we're now looking for a procedure on how those will be cleaned and maintained. All right, so that was the standard. Now we're going into the plus. So we did have to more recently update the plus requirements. So if you have your plus audit in the spring, you may not have had these new requirements. You might not be familiar with them. Again, these updates are on our website, and we actually have a summary document too. So if you want to see only what was changed, like the wording there, there's a summary document you can download. So these went into effect last summer. So if you have your audit in the fall, and you may have already also be aware of these changes. So here we have several new additional requirements. They're very nuanced. So you may be thinking to yourself, gee, that seems like I already do that. You might, but now it's explicitly written out in the standard. So I'll touch on those a little bit. So these were the general ones. And then we also have a few, two in field, and then more focused on the cleaning and maintenance in the post-harvest. So let's take a look first at the general requirements. So we had a presentation this morning about food safety culture, and there is now a component into specific language regarding food safety culture. when an organization reviews their food safety policy, they are looking to make sure that the auditor will look to see that there is evidence of a positive food safety culture within the organization. So we're looking for a good communication between the management team and the employees, that the employees feel supported and listened and heard when there is some sort of incident, that there's good open communication going back and forth between the two. This is specific to a post-harvest operation and a traceability program, but making sure that if a facility is providing product to a farm stand or CSA, community supported ag program, that they are keeping records of what product is going to that farm stand, that local operation. So just making sure that the traceability is included for those types of small programs. And then while we always had questions regarding a recall program, now the standard is asking specifically for certain components to be added into the recall procedure. So those components are making sure that basically there is a step-by-step process for how a product would be recalled, who would be communicated to if there was a recall. So that particular process, it talks about effectiveness checks, making sure that the operation is aware of how much of their product was actually recalled. Those types of details are now required into the recall procedure. And then lastly, in the general section is, while we have always said that workers should not handle or be in contact with food contact surfaces, we needed to specifically say that ill workers cannot be in the production area. So in the food handling areas, workers need to be excluded. So it's a little nuance of the language of the standard, but we needed to make it clearly spelled out, and so we had to add these additional requirements. As far as for the field requirements, we are having an additional terminology language. Something we're looking for in terms of the risk assessment in the field is to make sure that the risk assessment includes, if there are multiple fields in different locations, that there is part of the risk assessment is the cross-contamination between fields. How is that going to be handled within that operation? And then the verification of cleaning and sanitation, in particular for food contact surfaces. This was one that was added in 2021, but just want to reiterate that this is a plus question, that we're looking for, at minimum, a visual verification that the food contact surfaces are clean. And so we would be looking for the operation to have written procedures that spell out the frequency of cleaning, the methodology of cleaning, the type of cleaners being used, and that they're all appropriate for use. And then at a minimum, checking to see that visually the products, the food contact surfaces look clean. Some operations could opt to go above and beyond that visual inspection. They could do ATP swabbing or environmental monitoring, but that's not a requirement. So just want to throw that out there. And this is both in the field side and in the post-harvest side. All right, other post-harvest requirements are, we had now a requirement specifically for compressed air gases. So at a minimum, we're looking at these compressed air, the equipment you're using maybe to clean with, or probably we wouldn't be using it in this case as a product. Maybe a fresh operation might, but that if you're using it, that it is appropriate for use. So, you know, it's filtered, oil-free, that type of thing that we're looking for. We also have a requirement for environmental monitoring. However, there's a caveat for this. An environmental monitoring program would be something that the operation would need to make a determination that it's necessary based on their hazard analysis. So it's not something an auditor would go into your operation and say, oh yeah, you need to have an environmental monitoring program. It's going to be up to the operation to make this determination, and then it will be the auditor's responsibility to review the program and make sure that the operation is compliant with their own program. In terms of P61, basic housekeeping, again, this is a terminology thing that we needed to include in the standard for GFSI. So when we're talking about basic routine housekeeping, what we're trying to talk about is a foundational cleaning program, something that if you're not putting into place, then your cleaning and sanitation, your more advanced cleaning and sanitation program will not be effective. So for example, for this, we're just kind of more touching on broad cleaning as far as sweeping, tidying up, mopping, emptying trash, that kind of thing. So it's a much more basic look at cleaning and sanitation. If you have like a really messy facility, then obviously it would be more difficult to keep your equipment and your food contact surfaces clean. So kind of thinking on a more basic level. And then in terms of maintenance, this part is twofold. So maintenance activities, what we're trying to get at with that is first, that there is a routine maintenance program, so that you are routinely checking your equipment, condensers, evaporators, that kind of thing, that they are in good repair. So, you know, you don't want to have any kind of cracked or rusting equipment that may add cross-contamination issues in your operation. So that's the first part of it, making sure you have a routine program in place. But the second piece is, if you do have to do maintenance, you have to perform a repair or just your routine maintenance, that you have a cleaning and sanitizing procedure in place after it, to make sure that whatever maintenance you performed on the equipment or area, that it doesn't contribute to cross-contamination to the product after the maintenance has been completed. So that's kind of a twofold piece there. And then lastly, another GFSI requirement is for some sort of inventory management program. So this does need to be a written procedure for how an operation is going to keep track of their inventory, not just their products, but also their materials that they're using for their product. So maybe packaging in this case. And so it doesn't specify that it needs to be like a first in, first out. It's really up to the operation to determine what is the most appropriate use of their materials and products. It may be that you have customer requirements, and so you have quality as a part of your inventory management system. So there's a lot of flexibility with that particular requirement. All right, so that was me speeding through very quickly the past changes that we had. Now I know that there is a lot of, I guess there was a lot of focus questions on water. I only have 2 slides on water because there's not a whole lot to say. But I do have a new publication, if you haven't seen it, that came out last year. USDA published this water FAQ document, which again, you can get from our website. basically this document is in a Q&A format. So it asks a question and then provides an answer. It goes into a lot of detail on how you can comply with the GAP program's audit requirements for water. So we talk specifically about testing, what you need to test for, depending on the different types of water use, how many tests, so the frequency of the water tests, what type of criteria we're looking for. Again, depending whether it is pre-harvest water versus post-harvest water. So we go into all those details. There's even actually examples of water test results. So if you have struggle with actually reading your water test results and you're not sure, what they mean, there are different examples of laboratories and the results and how to interpret them. So highly recommend, if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it, to go there and check it out. And so I know that a very specific question regarding whether or not things are changing with, the produce safety rule now at least being regulated for post-harvest water. So I just want to reiterate that right now there are no changes. So for pre-harvest water, we are still on the audit standard is the same as we did last year and the year before. So there's no changes there. We aren't going to incorporate any changes until FDA finalizes that subpart E with the water rule. So again, I can't give you an exact time because we don't know either. For post-harvest water, now our standard says that it must meet the drinking water standard. So like Wes reiterated, that means no detectable E. coli in your sample. For us right now, our standard only requires that you have one annual water test for well water. That would be in the post-harvest situation. And it just needs to show that there is no detectable E. coli. And that is what we're going to continue to audit to. We will make a note that if you are taking 4 samples, we'll make a note for how many samples, water samples you are taking on this well post-harvest water, just for posterity, for information for the audit. But you won't be penalized. You won't not meet the criteria if you only have 1 water test at this moment in time. So I just want to reiterate that. And I will say that water FAQ document, we are going to plan to update that document when FDA finalizes their information. And once we know FDA has been educating and regulating at the same time, if something changes with how they are regulating that, then we will update our document as well, because the idea is for our standard to be in alignment with the produce safety rule. But honestly, because FDA hasn't really been specific, then we can't be specific. So for now, that is how we're going to address the water requirements. In terms of future changes, so right now we're actually in the process of updating the harmonized standard. So if you're not aware, the harmonized standard through International Fresh, there's a group of individuals who have made some suggested edits to the standard, and that is currently up on their website. So I'll drop that link also in the chat box for you all, because it's still, you have a couple of weeks actually, if you wanted to go and take a look at what the proposed standards are, the proposed changes are, and you can go there, you can take a look, and you can actually comment if you want to. They would recommend, they're looking for feedback. So I do recommend if you have the opportunity to go and check it out. Just to maybe give you some high level of what I can remember off the top of my mind as far as changes come. I know that they have tried to streamline some of the wording in terms of, in our standard, we have the wording for the water and, several different places. We've got it in the field section, we got it in field and harvest, and we've got it in post-harvest. So the language wasn't always consistent between those different sections. And now we're working to make sure that the language, the terminology that we use for water, water treatment, reused water, that all of that language is consistent throughout the different sections. So that's one thing that I know that they have worked on doing. Another thing is they've updated also how we have the recall with more specific details required in the recall procedure. That has been revamped as well in those changes for the proposed changes. So those are a few off the top of my mind that I know are there being proposed, and there's others as well. So highly recommend you go and take a look at that. For us, USDA will incorporate those changes after they're finalized. So we're looking at probably late summer for the final version of the standard to be released. And once that happens, then USDA will begin to draft a new version. And that'll take some time. So we'll publish the new version, most likely if the timeline goes as planned, next year. And then again, there will be that probably 60 days or so after it's published before it becomes implemented. So there'll be a window of opportunity for you to prepare before you have to go to the new standard. So, so yes, I would say that there will be changes coming, but definitely not until next year. And you may even, depending on when you get audited, miss. So it may even be, if you're being audited in the spring, early summer, then you may not be affected until 2025. So that's kind of the general timeline. Of course, it's not set in stone, but that's the idea. So that's all I've got. So if anybody has any questions.
Thank you, Jill. That was a lot of information.
I know.
It's good. I'm over here scribbling stuff. Does anyone have any questions for Jill about any of the harmonized and harmonized plus changes? All right. Well, you could see she's got the website there as well as the contact information for the audit services branch. And just as we've done in the past, when there are changes, significant changes that we feel everyone needs to know, we include those in our trainings, but we also put them on the plant and pest advisory.
Is there any water testing for nitrates that's required? For like, I've heard conflicting things with like our break room. If we need to test for nitrates, I did one time, and then the next time they said I don't need to test for that. So is there anything with nitrates for testing?
No, the water quality that we're concerned about is the microbial quality. So as far as chemical, there's nothing in our standard that requires that.
Can I elaborate on that? Or when you're talking
Please.
about your break room, are you talking about drinking water?
So this would be a break room for the farm where, I guess technically, yes, it's where we wash our hands after lunch or we go back out in the field.
That water would need to meet the drinking water standards.
Okay, so test for nitrates. We tested and then put a filtration system in. We were under the limit, and they said to then we did not need a test.
As long as the water test says it meets drinking water standards, I would be all right with that.
Okay.
Any other questions? All right, well, thanks, Jill. All right, so our last speaker of the day is Chris Kleingunther, our Bureau Chief of Inspections for New Jersey Department of Agriculture and the one who oversees USDA audits and FSMA PSR inspections in the state. Chris, Jen's got your slides up. Can you see them all right?
Yeah, I'm good.
All right, and you'll let her know when you need them advanced.
Absolutely.
All right, well,
So-
thank you for joining us today to talk about audit updates.
It's great to be here. All right, I'm Chris Kleingunther. I'm the Bureau Chief of Inspection Enforcement for the Department of Agriculture. I oversee many programs, which includes the USDA GAP program and the FSMA program. Today, we're going to talk about what we seen where there were some issues during the audits that are the common issues that we ran into this year. So go ahead, Jen. Next slide, please. All right, so we're going to start in general questions. The worker education and training, that needs to be records. There needs to be, as a supervisor has to have their training records. So documenting everybody's there. Some operations only have a few people. Some operations where there's a lot of people coming and going, we're going to need to see training for all responsible parties. Just when I'm out doing an audit myself, I will pick a few random people during my interview, then I'll go back and check the training records, just to let you know how it's done. The next one is the sampling procedures and prevailing regulations. This is the sampling procedures for microbiological testing, which also includes your water testing. So there needs to be written policies, when you're going to do it, how you're going to do it, and all the documentation required. Next slide, please. So the testing procedures and actions, all required testing require a written policy for the microbiological test procedures, actions, and action to take if the results don't come in as expected. Traceability, we talked about traceability. Traceability exercise is one step back, one step forward. I need to have when it was done, the time and dates it was done, how long it took. For instance, if I come into your packing house, I see a pallet there and I say, I want to see the traceability on this pallet. You're going to need to show me that and have the written records to verify all that. Trace back, trace forward exercise shall be performed annually. Again, we want to see one of the most recent records. Your mock recall, that needs to be done with a written policy. There needs to be the date, the time, the commodity, who you did the recall with, the counts, everything all needs to be corresponding and the records to back that up. All right, and the one we run into is non-conforming product. So how you're going to segregate the non-conforming product, how you're going to have the product marked. So if it's non-conforming to your standards, and have a written policy and records to back that up. Worker and health and hygiene toilet facilities. My favorite. Toilet facilities shall be adequate for the number and in compliance with the applicable regulations. So that's 1 seat per 20 workers. And you have to have a male and female facility. Toilet wash stations shall be maintained in clean and sanitary conditions. We run into this a lot. You can expect me to come up if you're using porta-johns with hand washing to check the water to make sure there is water, there is paper towels. Trying to get me, huh, Jen?
I wanted to throw you a little curveball.
And make sure, and we do run into this a lot. I mean, if you're using a service that's supplying the water and everything, you really need to check to make sure that they're doing it, because I've run into it more than once. And it seems to happen annually with the service companies. I'll look on the records, they were there that morning, but there's, I'm there, they were there at 7, I'm there at 8, and there's no water. So you really need to keep a check on that. A response plan, if your response plan is to call your service agency, I need to know what their plans are to do and what your plans are to do in the meantime. We can go now. Jewelry policy. So the jewelry policy, you have to have a jewelry policy. It says to meet the prevailing regulations. The prevailing regulations that I would go by would be the FSMA regulation, which hand jewelry that cannot be adequately cleaned and sanitized must be removed or covered. However, if your jewelry policy is something like, hey, no jewelry permitted, don't change your policy because you're going above and beyond prevailing regulations. Personal belongings in the packing area and in the field, we run into this a lot. Again, we go back to food safety culture of leaving their personal belongings, on the road, in the vans, in the trucks, and not in the fields. Next slide, please. All right, drinking water. Here we go with water, everybody's favorite. Drinking water must always be available to employees and records are required. So if there's bottled water, I need the receipts. If there's a well, I need the test to prove that that's potable, meets the drinking water standards, and it's from a municipality, I need a copy of their water test also. Waste management demonstrates control and storage and disposal of waste. It is not a source of contamination. Dumpster lids, trash cans, all with lids, paper towels blowing away from the porta-johns. Those are just some of the issues we ran into. Assessment of potential unauthorized access. So this goes back to your food security and food safety of who's coming, who's going, and what you're doing to either prevent or allow who's allowed on the farm or the packing house. And I need the emergency response plan, what you will do in an emergency. And that's a written policy with records if there was any kind of incidents. And going back one, I'm sorry, the assessment is needed annually for your unauthorized, potential unauthorized access. Next slide, please. All right, and harmonized plus initially, at least annually thereafter, the operation shall evaluate and document the risk associated with the food defense. And I need to see those records and they need to be kept and signed and dated as everything else. Water risk assessment. My biggest advice on this water risk assessment is that of course, there's these things, but this is something you want to start now when you're getting ready for the growing season, when you're starting to check out the wells, moving pumps, moving pipe and all that. This is something that starts now and goes through the season. So, your historical testing of your water source, the characteristics of the crops, the methods of application, complete assessment and consideration of all hazards, and an annual risk assessment. Next slide. All right, water test. I'm going to go back to the produce safety rule and talk about the third-party audit here in the same thing. So initially, like I said, this year will be an educational inspection for the produce safety rule or FSMA on those inspections. So the audit requires what you see here, groundwater 1 time a year, surface water 3 times a year, municipal a certificate. I've been going back and forth with FDA, and I'm going to actually reach out to them again today and see if I can get any answers on those of you who have been doing audits for 10 years, have been doing the testing and have the documentation, whether you're required. That being said, if I'm out for a produce safety inspection and you've only done 1 test on each well, I'm going to educate you on what the produce safety rule requires. And that's all I can tell you at this point. But I've gotten nothing official back, but once I do, we will let you know through either Rutgers or our website. So again, it's an educational. We're not going to issue any fines. We don't issue any fines. We're not going to, Anybody says they're gonna shut you down, you need to call my office right away and ask for me because my people can't be telling you that. So until we get clarification from FDA and USDA on what exactly they're gonna look for, just continue to do what you've been doing. Next slide. Animal activity. So you need to do your annual risk assessment. You need to do your monitoring and keep the records when you're monitoring, a written policy for both. A written policy and the records are required. So if you have a written, an animal risk assessment, you want to do that just as you would do any other assessment. And you want to have your regular records documentation, again, dated, signed, and that's what we will be looking for. Next slide. Cleaning and maintenance of harvest tools. This gets a little crazy, especially, you know, if with knives and stuff and how people prefer to have their own knives and getting them cleaned. Just we ran into some issues and some of the tools leaving the farm and being out of your control. So I need to have a written policy in the records of when you're cleaning and sanitizing and maintaining your records. Use of container and bins, a written policy of containers for non-harvest purposes, and mark containers that are not used for harvesting. You know, there's the plastic bins, there's the crates that you guys use and you put some tools in there, but if they're not marked, not for harvest or for tools only, you're gonna have an issue. Next slide, please. Produce sourcing. Again, with a harmonized audit, you're allowed to do one commodity or many commodities. So if all produce is grown to the harmonized standards. So if you're answering yes to that question, you're only having one commodity audited. I would really like to see the records that you would keep for the other commodities. The new one, the packet house analysis, hazard analysis needs to be done and documented. And an initial risk assessment, and the assessments are mandatory and need to be done annually. Next slide. Cleaning agents. All right, we went through that cleaning agents pretty well this morning and covered a lot of the things. I was happy that Donna came up with the Clorox because a lot of growers do use Clorox, but the times are something I particularly look at. So with the Saturday is 45 seconds, Clorox is 2 minutes, and then the wash afterwards. Basically, you want to be looking at those labels and making sure you're doing it right, because I'm going to be asking questions about how long the saturation point is and how long you're using it, how you're using it, and if you're following the steps that are done. You know, we get people who just say, okay, I sprayed the line down with bleach, and, you know, that's where some of the issues. Food contact surfaces should be cleaned and sanitized and made according to your food safety plan. And then we will check to make sure everything's clean, looking for your records, looking at the surfaces. Those of you who've been through audits know what we do. So we just come in and we're checking everything. Next slide, please. Document scheduled assessment of your water system. We've gone over that. So you need to go, again, that's going to be something you're probably going to be starting now or in the next few weeks. Keep all the records of your maintenance, your backflows, and everything else. I'm not particularly looking for, you know, a little minor repair to be documented, but something that actually it gets the system and could anyway cross contamination or something. Basically, what I usually tell growers, if this is something that aggravates you and costs you a lot of money, you need to document. Reused water must be treated using approved antimicrobials, and that's mandatory. Microbial standards and corrective actions, control, monitor. These are if you're using whatever you're using needs to be required. The records. And again, we'll be looking at the labels to see if you're using them according to the label. Next slide. Incoming packaging material, there needs to be a written policy on how you're accepting, what you're taking. We're going to review the records, procedures, and examples of the package. It's a written policy and the records are required. Cooler equipment shall be maintained and not a source of product contamination. We'll be going through the coolers. A written policy is needed. Records of cleaning, sanitizing, whatever you're doing in there needs to be done. We'll be looking for that. We'll be looking at the coolers, at your condensers, your compressors, and everything else. Next slide. Transportation. So we get a lot of this is there's not a written policy for the products, what temperatures to hold or anything like that. A lot of you guys just move your product from the farm to a packing house, but you need to have the policy of required. If you're not requiring refrigeration because it's a short trip, I need to see that in writing. The shipping units need to be written procedures and a checklist to verify their functionality. That's a written policy and the records are mandatory. All right, so we have changed with COVID and it seemed to work out better for better quality audits. So we require you to send us a lot of the documentation prior to the farm visit. So I would need your proof of food safety check, your training, your food safety plan, your current water tests, training records for all personnel, 10 days of supporting records. And when I say that, that's the records of your cleaning, your sanitizing, anywhere on the audits where it says records are required, your mock recall and documentation, and your self-audit. We usually need that a good 7 days prior to your audit for the auditor to review. Next slide. So for your audit information, this is the general information. You can email your request to fvinspection@ag.nj.gov. Your average on-site depends on the type of audit, usually 4 to 8 hours, and a complete audit's going anywhere from 10 to 14, 15 hours, depending on the size of the operation. Cost is determined by travel and time. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jill, but it's $132 an hour now, and that includes the review of all paperwork, on-site time, and all whatever's involved in the audit. Again, one thing I want to mention is the RMA for you guys. A lot of you guys got a harmonized audit was free. That is no longer, that ran out in November. So audits will be, you will have to pay for your audit this year. And I think that's it, Jen. Is there any questions?
I have a question on the portable toilets. So are we supposed to do a water test of like the water for hand washing, like, you know, the hand washing stations on the side of the portable toilet?
If you're supplying the water, I would need the well. I would need, you know, that water test. If your service agency is supplying the water, I need a water test from them.
Okay.
Any other questions for Chris? No. All right, well, he
So
shared
with
info
that
on.
being said, I'll just wrap up is we are actually out doing audits now. We're doing one today. We will be starting our produce safety inspections for indoor operations next week. And we will be coming out weekly. We are giving you a heads up call that we're coming for the produce safety inspection. But as for the audit, the sooner you can get your audit scheduled, the better.